Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Chris. The moment you stop tolerating emotional manipulation is the moment a manipulator either changes completely or reveals they never actually valued you. And in my case, my wife changed because she realized I'd finally meant what I said. I'd been married to Rosemary for 3 years when she told me intimacy would only happen once a month until I put her on a salary for my business. 3 years of gradually allowing her to control our relationship through emotional withdrawal and cold silence. 3 years of choosing peace over self-respect until the day I decided that if I were only needed once a month, I'd only come home once a month. We met when I was 27 and she was 25, both living in Nashville. I'd recently started my own small business, a commercial landscaping company that serviced office parks and retail properties. Rosemary was working in retail management when we met through mutual friends at a weekend cookout. The early relationship felt easy and comfortable. Rosemary was attractive and personable, and she had explicit opinions about what she wanted in life. I was conflict avoidant by nature, accommodating, and eager to make people happy. We seemed to complement each other. Her decisiveness balanced my flexibility. We dated for about a year before getting engaged. The relationship during that time was mostly smooth. We'd have occasional disagreements, but nothing serious. Rosemary would sometimes get her way through persistence, but I didn't see that as problematic. I thought it was just a typical relationship negotiation. We got married in a modest ceremony with family and close friends. Then we moved into a much bigger rental house in a decent neighborhood. Started building our life together. Early in our marriage, we discussed whether Rosemary would keep working or stay home. My landscaping business was doing well enough to comfortably support us both. Rosemary said she was tired of retail management, that dealing with customers, inventory, and scheduling was draining her. She suggested staying home, at least for a while. Said she'd manage the household, handle domestic responsibilities, and maybe eventually help with my business if it made sense. I agreed readily. I thought having her home would actually be nice. Coming home to a partner who wasn't exhausted from their own workday, having someone available to handle errands and household management during business hours. The arrangement seemed to work initially. Rosemary handled cooking and cleaning. I'd come home from long days managing landscaping crews to a clean house and dinner ready. The division of labor felt equitable, even though only I was earning income. But gradually, subtle patterns emerged that I didn't recognize as problematic until much later. Rosemary started changing household rules frequently. She would decide suddenly that my work clothes needed to be organized differently in the closet, that I should spend my limited free time doing specific projects around the house rather than relaxing as I wanted, that certain friends were bad influences, and I should limit contact with them. Each request or demand seemed minor on its own, not worth arguing about. I'd accommodate because maintaining peace felt more critical than asserting my preferences about closet organization or how I spent Sunday afternoons. My natural tendency to avoid conflict made me an easy target for this dynamic. I'd been raised in a household where keeping peace meant not making waves, where disagreement was uncomfortable and was to be avoided, where saying yes was easier than defending your position. Rosemary learned quickly, probably unconsciously at first, that complaining or withdrawing emotionally would get her what she wanted from me. When I'd express even mild discomfort with something she decided, her response followed a predictable pattern. She'd become cold, giving short, clipped responses to questions. She would stop showing any affection. No touching, no warmth, no connection. Sometimes she would sleep facing away from me in bed, creating this wall of ice between us. The emotional withdrawal was incredibly effective. I hated conflict and distance more than I valued asserting myself. So I'd return within hours, or at most a day, apologizing or giving in even when I hadn't actually done anything wrong. This pattern repeated dozens of times over the first 2 years of marriage. Each time, I reinforced to Rosemary that her displeasure was enough to move me, that emotional coldness was a tool she could deploy to get compliance. She started believing, And I can only speculate, but this seems accurate based on later conversations, that she controlled the emotional atmosphere of our relationship, that I would eventually always listen, and her withdrawing affection was sufficient leverage to get whatever she wanted. And I reinforced this belief constantly by folding every single time. The dynamic was toxic, but I didn't recognize it. I just thought this was how marriage worked. That compromise meant I compromised and she got her way. That maintaining harmony meant accepting her terms. My business was doing well. The landscaping company had grown from just me and a helper to 5 full-time employees and multiple ongoing contracts. I was making good money, enough to support our lifestyle comfortably and save for future goals. Rosemary had been staying home for about 2 years at this point. The household management had become less comprehensive over time. Cooking was less frequent, cleaning was adequate but not exceptional. The domestic responsibilities she'd taken on had gradually diminished, while my financial responsibilities had only increased. I didn't complain about this. Figured she was comfortable with our arrangement, and I shouldn't micromanage how she spent her days at home. Then one evening, after I'd come home from a particularly long day managing multiple job sites, Rosemary made a demand that shocked me. She said she wanted me to put her on a monthly salary for my business. Said she'd been thinking about it and decided she deserved to be paid for being a stay-at-home wife. The demand caught me entirely off guard for several reasons. First, I'd previously invited Rosemary to work with me in the business. When the company was expanding about a year earlier, I'd suggested she could help with administrative tasks, scheduling, billing, customer communications. She'd refused, saying she had no interest in the landscaping business and preferred staying home. Second, she wasn't currently participating in the business. Didn't help with paperwork, didn't manage scheduling, didn't interact with clients. Her staying home was entirely separate from my business operations. Third, she was framing this as payment for being a stay-at-home wife. Not for contributing to the business, but simply for existing in our marriage while I provided financially. The logic didn't make sense. I was already supporting us both entirely from my business income. She had access to our joint account, could spend reasonably on household needs and personal wants. What she was asking for was a separate salary on top of the already full financial support. For one of the very few times in our marriage, I said no firmly. Told her I wasn't going to pay her a salary for not working. That if she wanted to earn money from the business, she could actually work in the business, like I'd previously offered. Rosemary's response was immediate emotional shutdown. She went cold. Stopped speaking to me beyond necessary conversations about bills. She acted offended and wounded whenever I was in the room. I'd seen this pattern dozens of times. I expected she'd stay cold for a day, then we'd talk and find some compromise. But this time was different. Days passed, and she remained completely withdrawn. Barely spoke to me, and left a space when I entered. She avoided eye contact and refused any physical affection or warmth. 1 week became 2 weeks. The longest she'd ever maintained the cold treatment. I gave her space, figuring she needed time to process her disappointment and didn't push for conversation or reconciliation. I just continued my routine, working long days, coming home to a house where my wife treated me like an unwelcome stranger. About 2 weeks into this Cold War, I attempted to initiate intimacy one evening. We'd always had a healthy physical relationship despite other problems. I thought a physical connection could help break through the emotional distance. Rosemary rejected me immediately, then said something that changed everything. She told me flatly that intimacy would be once a month until I placed her on a salary for my business. The statement was so calculated, so transactional, so explicitly manipulative that it cut through my usual conflict avoidance like a knife. She was weaponizing our physical relationship, holding intimacy hostage to get financial demands met, treating sex as a bargaining chip rather than an expression of connection between spouses. I didn't argue, try to negotiate, or convince her that this was wrong. I just said okay. But internally, something fundamental shifted. I went to bed that night thinking clearly for the first time in our marriage. Seeing the pattern I'd been enabling and understanding that I'd trained Rosemary through years of accommodation, that emotional manipulation would always work on me. And I realized I was done accepting it. I woke up the next morning with absolute clarity about what I needed to do. Rosemary had said intimacy would be once a month and had made evident through her behavior that my presence and participation in our marriage were conditional on meeting her financial demands. If I were only needed once a month for intimacy, then I'd only come home once a month for anything. Before leaving for work that day, I quietly packed essentials. Clothes for several weeks. Toiletries. Work equipment I'd need. Some personal items and sentimental things. Everything necessary to avoid needing to return home. I loaded everything into my truck while Rosemary was still in the bedroom, then left for work like it was a typical day. My business had an office space, a small building with a couple of desks, a bathroom, and storage for equipment. Before getting married, I'd slept there occasionally when working late and too tired to drive home. It was not comfortable for long-term sleeping, but adequate. That's where I went after finishing work that day. Instead of driving home like I had every single evening for 3 years, I stayed at the office. I turned on D&D on my phone. I didn't want to deal with calls or messages. I needed space to think clearly without Rosemary's emotional manipulation influencing my decisions. I imagine Rosemary expected me home at my usual time, around 6 or 7 in the evening. When I didn't arrive, she probably initially assumed I was working late. But as the hours passed and I didn't come home, her confidence in her control must have started to collapse. By midnight, I briefly checked my phone to see if there were any actual emergencies. I found dozens of missed calls and frantic text messages from my wife. The messages progressed from annoyed to worried to panicked. Where was I? Why wasn't I answering? Was I okay? Demanding that I respond immediately. I didn't respond. Just turned the phone on D&D again and went to sleep on the office couch. Apparently, I learned this later. Rosemary had called everyone, including my friends, asking if they'd seen me or knew where I was. She called my siblings and my parents, creating this massive panic about my disappearance. She'd even called the police to report me missing because I hadn't come home and wasn't answering my phone. The police asked her to wait 24 hours before they do anything. This reaction revealed everything about how she'd viewed our relationship. She'd expected compliance, expected that her emotional withdrawal and sexual ultimatum would bring me to heel like every previous time she'd used these tactics. My actual disappearance was entirely outside her script. Everyone started calling me. Friends said Rosemary was worried sick. Family members asked if I was okay. Rosemary's panic activated everyone. After about 36 hours away, I finally called her back. Used the office phone. Rosemary answered immediately. From her voice, I could tell she panicked in ways I'd never heard before. She said she thought something had happened to me, that I always came home, that she'd been terrified. I responded calmly, told her she'd been cold for 2 weeks, that she'd said intimacy would be once a month. So I decided to start coming home once a month. The logical simplicity of it hit her harder than any argument or emotional reaction could have. I'd taken her ultimatum and applied it consistently. If our marriage were reduced to once monthly interaction, I'd participate once a month. It's a perfectly reasonable extension of the terms she'd set. Rosemary started begging, asking me to please come home, that she hadn't meant it like that she didn't want to lose me. I asked her directly, if she didn't want to lose me, why had she been acting cold and disrespectful for weeks? Why had she made sex conditional on financial demands? Her answer was honest in its simplicity. She just wanted her way. That admission was the real turning point. The moment when Rosemary apparently recognized that her tactics had finally pushed me past the point of tolerance. I told her I'd come home. We needed to have a serious conversation about our marriage and how we treated each other. When I arrived home, Rosemary met me with genuine vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. The confident controller had been replaced by someone who'd realized she'd nearly destroyed her marriage. She admitted that she'd only asked for the salary because she wanted money for personal needs. Not because she was contributing anything, just because she felt entitled to separate income beyond the household funds she already had access to. I explained calmly why I couldn't pay her for doing nothing, that I'd offered her actual work in the business before and she'd rejected it, that if she wanted to earn money, she could earn it through contribution, not through entitlement. Rosemary offered immediately to work with me now if I still wanted her to. The same offer she'd rejected a year ago was suddenly acceptable because she'd realized the alternative was losing the marriage entirely. I agreed, told her we could discuss what role would make sense for her in the business. But the dynamic in our marriage needed to change fundamentally, that I wouldn't continue accepting emotional manipulation and cold treatment as her tools for getting her way, that if she had needs or wants, she could express them directly, and we could discuss them like adults, but I was done being controlled through withdrawal and ultimatums. Rosemary agreed to everything. She even promised things would be different. And for the first time in our marriage, I actually believed her, not because of her words, but because she'd experienced real consequences for her behavior. The crisis reset our dynamic completely. Rosemary started working part-time with my business within a week. Initially, just administrative tasks, managing scheduling, handling invoicing, communicating with clients about appointments and services. She was actually good at it, had organizational skills and customer service experience from her retail management background. She made herself genuinely valuable for the business operations. More importantly, having her own earned income resolved the financial tension. She was making money through actual contribution rather than demanding it as an entitlement. She had her own sense of accomplishment and value beyond managing a household. The broader changes in our relationship were even more significant. Rosemary stopped weaponizing emotional coldness. When we had disagreements, and we still had them, she'd express her perspective directly rather than shutting down and withdrawing affection until I capitulated. She stopped making unreasonable demands backed by emotional ultimatums. Stopped trying to control my friendships or free time through guilt and manipulation. I became more assertive, more willing to say no when something didn't work for me, more insistent on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. I no longer folded immediately when Rosemary expressed displeasure. I would listen to her concerns, but also express my own. We would work toward an actual compromise rather than just giving in to end the conflict. The power dynamic, so skewed toward Rosemary's control, shifted toward an actual partnership. We started communicating better. Not perfectly, we're both still learning, but significantly better than the toxic pattern we'd fallen into. Disagreements still happened, but the difference was fundamental. Rosemary didn't make unrealistic threats. I didn't tolerate emotional manipulation. We both understood that we'd reached a breaking point that had served as a warning about what happens when respect disappears from a relationship. I never had to sleep outside again. Not because I couldn't or wouldn't, but because Rosemary stopped pushing unreasonable demands that would drive me to that point. She'd learned through direct experience that I meant what I said. That ultimatums would be met with consequences she didn't want. That she couldn't control the marriage through emotional withdrawal, because I'd simply withdraw further. We're still imperfect, still have arguments sometimes, still disagree about things both large and small. But the nature of our conflicts is different now. We argue about legitimate issues, how to spend money, where to vacation, and when to visit family. Normal relationship friction. Rosemary doesn't threaten to withhold intimacy to get her way. I don't tolerate being treated with contempt or cold dismissal when I say no to something. Looking back now, about 18 months since that crisis, I understand so much more clearly what happened in our marriage and why. I learned that conflict avoidance enables abuse. My natural tendency to avoid confrontation, to say yes to maintain peace, to accommodate rather than assert myself. All of that created the perfect environment for Rosemary to develop controlling behaviors. I learned that emotional manipulation works exactly as long as you let it work. Rosemary's pattern of going cold and withdrawing affection was only effective because I kept capitulating to it. The moment I stopped responding predictably, the tactic lost all power. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a relationship is establish rigid boundaries. My leaving wasn't abandonment. It was forcing a reckoning that desperately needed to happen. I learned that people can change when they face real consequences. Rosemary wasn't fundamentally abusive or malicious. She developed destructive patterns because those patterns worked. When they stopped working, she showed different behavior. Most importantly, I learned that self-respect isn't negotiable. I can't maintain a healthy relationship while allowing myself to be manipulated and controlled. That partnership requires mutual respect, or it's not actually a partnership. The broader changes in our relationship were even more significant. Rosemary stopped weaponizing emotional coldness. When we had disagreements, and we still had them, she'd express her perspective directly rather than shutting down and withdrawing affection until I capitulated. She stopped making unreasonable demands backed by emotional ultimatums. Stopped trying to control my friendships or free time through guilt and manipulation. I became more assertive, more willing to say no when something didn't work for me, more insistent on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. I no longer folded immediately when Rosemary expressed displeasure. I would listen to her concerns, but also express my own. We would work toward an actual compromise rather than just giving in to end the conflict. The power dynamic, so skewed toward Rosemary's control, shifted toward an actual partnership. We started communicating better. Not perfectly, we're both still learning, but significantly better than the toxic pattern we'd fallen into. Disagreements still happened, but the difference was fundamental. Rosemary didn't make unrealistic threats. I didn't tolerate emotional manipulation. We both understood that we'd reached a breaking point that had served as a warning about what happens when respect disappears from a relationship. I never had to sleep outside again. Not because I couldn't or wouldn't, but because Rosemary stopped pushing unreasonable demands that would drive me to that point. She'd learned through direct experience that I meant what I said. That ultimatums would be met with consequences she didn't want. That she couldn't control the marriage through emotional withdrawal, because I'd simply withdraw further. We're still imperfect. Still have arguments sometimes. Still disagree about things both large and small. But the nature of our conflicts is different now. We argue about legitimate issues, how to spend money, where to vacation, and when to visit family. Normal relationship friction. Rosemary doesn't threaten to withhold intimacy to get her way. I don't tolerate being treated with contempt or cold dismissal when I say no to something. Looking back now, about 18 months since that crisis, I understand so much more clearly what happened in our marriage and why. I learned that conflict avoidance enables abuse. My natural tendency to avoid confrontation, to say yes to maintain peace, to accommodate rather than assert myself, all of that created the perfect environment for Rosemary to develop controlling behaviors. I learned that emotional manipulation works exactly as long as you let it work. Rosemary's pattern of going cold and withdrawing affection was only effective because I kept capitulating to it. The moment I stopped responding predictably, the tactic lost all power. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a relationship is establish rigid boundaries. My leaving wasn't abandonment. It was forcing a reckoning that desperately needed to happen. I learned that people can change when they face real consequences. Rosemary wasn't fundamentally abusive or malicious. She developed destructive patterns because those patterns worked. When they stopped working, she showed different behavior. Most importantly, I learned that self-respect isn't negotiable. I can't maintain a healthy relationship while allowing myself to be manipulated and controlled. That partnership requires mutual respect, or it's not actually a partnership. Some people might think my response was extreme, that leaving for 36 hours and refusing to answer calls was cruel or vindictive. But those people don't understand what has been happening in our marriage over the past 3 years. The constant emotional manipulation, and the cold treatment that was designed to force compliance. The escalation to weaponizing intimacy as a bargaining tool. I tried talking, had tried expressing discomfort with her patterns, and had tried setting boundaries through words. None of it worked because Rosemary had learned that my words were meaningless, that I'd always eventually fold when she applied enough emotional pressure. Actions were the only language that would communicate effectively. And my action, leaving and staying gone until she understood I was serious, spoke clearly enough to cut through years of established dysfunction. I don't regret how I handled it, nor do I regret the shock it gave Rosemary or the panic it caused. My only regret is that it took me 3 years to finally stand up for myself. I tolerated being manipulated for so long before recognizing what was happening and refusing to accept it anymore. Our marriage now isn't perfect. We still have areas we need to work on. Communication could be better. We should go to counseling to address some lingering patterns. But it's healthier than it's ever been, based on mutual respect, rather than one person controlling the other through emotional manipulation. Rosemary contributes to our household now both domestically and financially. She has her own sense of purpose beyond managing me. We're both better versions of ourselves than we were during those first 3 years of dysfunction. And we both know, though we don't discuss it explicitly, that we came very close to destroying something that's actually become good. But I'm also prepared now. Know that if patterns ever regress toward that old dysfunction, I won't tolerate it for 3 years before acting. I will recognize it immediately and address it directly. We'll leave again if I need to, but permanently next time. Because I've learned my worth. Learned that I deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. Learned that being conflict avoidant doesn't mean accepting mistreatment to maintain false peace. That's my story. And I'd make the same choice again, without hesitation, because self-respect isn't optional. It's fundamental. And no relationship is worth losing yourself to maintain. Not even marriage. Especially not marriage.